and welcome to the EisnerAmper Engaging Alternatives podcast series. I'm your host, Elana Margulies-Snyderman, and with me today is Sean Emory, founder and CIO of Avory Co, which manages a high-conviction equities strategy. Today, Sean will share his outlook for high-conviction equities investing, including the greatest opportunities, challenges, and more. Before we dive into the conversation with Sean, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to EisnerAmper wherever you listen to your podcasts. And you can also find us on YouTube at EisnerAmper. Hi, Sean. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So to kick off the conversation, tell us a little about yourself and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Avory Company, we're about a decade old in terms of time. I founded it with a partner, Luis Alvarez. Our background, or my background, really started early days where my analytical skills started to bloom, in the teens, right? Where I was doing fantasy baseball. And a lot of the characteristics of that, are very similar to that of the investment world. You're buying low, selling high, you're using statistics to, find many of the characteristics that you're looking for. From there, obviously I went to, university where I became an analyst at an endowment, was plucked there to become an analyst at the endowment's leaders hedge fund, covering small and mid caps. As time went on, I was able to go to a much larger firm where I was a research analyst and then became the director of research. From there, I felt comfortable and confident enough to branch off and start Avory again over a decade ago. And really our focus is really around investing where the world is headed. And that really falls into two camps. You have these secular winners and you have these transitional stories. And ultimately, we're trying to find these secular winners that are, characterized more as growth stories. And on the other side are these transformation companies where, these are companies that are legacy in nature, good foundations, but also ones that we think have inherent value in them. And, that in a nutshell is kind of a little bit of the upbringing of, what brought me to Avory and kind of how the origin story of the firm started.
At EisnerAmper, we are creative problem solvers that take a 360-degree approach focusing on you. We're an award-winning firm with decades of experience providing accounting and advisory services. EisnerAmper. Let's get you ready.
Sean, given your focus on high-conviction equities investing, I would love to hear your high-level outlook for the space.
Yeah, look, I think at first is really to define what high conviction is. I mean, to us, it's 8 to 25 companies in a portfolio. There's plenty of studies that show that, when you're below kind of this 8, security threshold, you're starting to take too much non-market risk. Beyond that, above 25, it's actually really hard to perform, above and beyond the markets. And so with that mindset, what we wanted to do was carve out, kind of this mid-teens portfolio of securities where we think we can outperform the markets, have, enough names in the portfolio to manage risk, and then focus on, generally the fundamentals. But the outlook for high conviction investing to us is, in our view, is sound. If you look over the last decade, what you've seen is a lot of index funds, a lot of passive money flowing into a lot of these ETFs. And there's nothing wrong with that per se, but what it's led to is a lot of fundamentals being, put to the side and flows being the number one, process of investing. So you have high concentrated indices, the S&P and NASDAQ and Dow. And then at the same time, there's a lack of, fundamental analysis that I think that's happening in that investment world. 401ks, all this passive money and kind of systematic money is flowing into those. And we think over the next decade, what you're going to see is a lot more, active management, high conviction, this 8 to 25, portfolios where we think, if you're going to win, that's the only way to win in a world that is, highly diversified and, index-based.
And Sean, more specifically, what are some of the greatest opportunities you see in your space and why?
Yeah, we're obviously in a world of AI, and it definitely feels if you play with many of the products, whether it's the ChatGPTs of the world, which is kind of the early days of what all of us have engaged with from an AI perspective. But that's really like the tip of the iceberg. I think beyond that, it really starts to surface across different industries. So you're looking at transportation. And we're talking about companies in this space, like trucking companies that are fully autonomous in Texas, that are literally taking carloads of goods and goods from place to place, all through AI or automated systems. additionally, you have, some of the big companies that we're talking about, the private company or part of Google, and with Waymo, you have someone like Tesla, which just launched. What does that do to the overall landscape of the flow of goods, the flow of services, the flow of people? It reminds me a lot of, the internet, where it unlocked this kind of 24/7, 365 of e-commerce, where brick and mortar stores back in the days, they had to be open from, 9 to 5. And then there was no more commerce that took place. And ultimately, when the internet was, started, you saw this 24/7, 365. I think the same thing's happening in transportation. But beyond that, we're going from a physical world to even more digital world with all these productivity tools. And what's that going to do to the workforce? What's that going to do to many of these other areas? So I think AI is one theme, but I think it fills a lot of different buckets across all different industries and sectors.
Sean, on the other hand, what are some of the greatest challenges you face in your space and why?
Yeah, I think, there's a lack of patience in this world. And, for a company that is long-term, fundamentally driven, sometimes it takes time to play out. And we have great investors, but at the same time, you want investors that, can be patient across the story. And with the, the launches of all these different, brokerage accounts and brokerage firms where you can make money really quickly or lose money really quickly, that type of, I think, mentality has flowed across the spectrum. And we've seen statistics where holding times have, gone from years to days to weeks. And so ultimately, that is the biggest challenge I think like asset managers more broadly face, but also high conviction ones, which are looking for these dislocated assets that have, fundamental characteristics that you are looking for. But at the same time, it may take time for the market to realize that, because you really actually need active money to go after it versus some of these passive flows. So that's, I think, the biggest challenge is just, making sure that, people are patient about, investing.
Sean, we've covered a lot of ground today and wanted to see if there are any final thoughts you would like to share with us.
Generally speaking, again, at Avory, we're trying to invest where the world is headed. It's ultimately our mantra. There's a lot going on. If you wanted to find out more, we're all across the internet. And you can find out more, what we're thinking and how we're thinking about it. But, that's really where I'll leave it.
Sean, I want to thank you so much for sharing your perspective with our listeners.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And thank you for listening to the EisnerAmper podcast series. Visit EisnerAmper.com for more information on this and a host of other topics. And join us for our next EisnerAmper podcast when we get down to business.